Hello, my friends, and everyone interested in this ancient text called the Bible. We are back in Exodus. We finished up our gospel project called The Long Table. It's a two-part series. Part 1 just launched this past Sunday. Part 2 is coming out this next Sunday. Really want to encourage you guys to check that out. It's just a basic, fundamental, bare bones look at what the gospel is and then what it means when somebody says yes, they want to believe in Jesus. So please check that out. We put a lot of work into that and just really excited to work on that project for the Lord. Okay, so we're getting back into Exodus. Today we are going through chapters 26 through 31, and we're gonna have to kind of tie in chapter 25 a little bit. We've already talked about some elements there, but we're gonna discover that these chapters that consist of like some boring instructions and measurements and materials and details to us might seem really mundane and like, why is this in there? But to the original reader, it's going to be painting a picture for them of something that would draw their attention back to the Garden of Eden when God wanted to dwell with his people to begin with. Yeah, the Bible's about to get very real. We might get a little bit colorful, so buckle up and welcome to Dumb Christian. When God made the promise to Abraham that he was going to bring Abraham's descendants through his son Isaac into the promised land, the land of Canaan, it wasn't just that God was going to kind of give them this place where they could live and then, hands off, have fun. No, it was that he wanted to be with a descendants of Abraham, just like he was with Abraham. And Jewish tradition talks about how Abraham understood there was some sort of like mode of sacrifice involved in having a relationship with God, being in his presence because of sin and whatever. Although we don't really see a whole lot of that in the Bible, there is some like tradition and some background that says Abraham had an understanding of what that meant. We go back to Adam and Eve, right? Like their kids were making sacrifices. It was an understood practice that there's something about this. For us to have a relationship with God, this needs to be involved. And these next few chapters, 26 through 31, are going to give us a little bit of an insight as to what's actually going on in the sacrificial system, because it's not like the other pagan gods and these other religions where the gods must be appeased, or their appetites have to be satisfied, or they have to be indulged so that they'll like us and they'll be happy with us. No, repeatedly, God is saying, I want to be with you. I already love you. I already desire to be with you. I want to dwell among you. It's not a system of trying to get on God's good side. So what is happening here? Because God wants to dwell with these descendants of Abraham, with the nation of Israel, but he's going to require sacrifice. And just like we've already seen in chapter 19 and 20, kind of, when God appeared on the mountain, this is actually while God is still giving instructions to Moses, and that's going to, there's going to be some hell to pay when he comes down off the mountain, but Moses is still on the mountain, and what preceded Moses being on the mountain to receive these instructions was God said the people of Israel are commanded to come up to the edge, to the base of the mountain, but they can't come any closer. So they're supposed to come close enough that they can see the lightning, hear the thunder, feel the earth trembling, feel the heat coming off of like this fiery mountain, but not so close that they enter into the next level of sacred space, holy ground, right? Like that's where God is, and he wants his people to come near, but we're going to see even from that position, it's kind of setting the stage for there are these zones of holiness or sacred space, as some scholars talk about. These zones of holiness, and the closer you get to God, the more kind of processes and rituals that you have to go through to be ritually clean in order to enter the presence of God. And this is how it's going to be established when we start to see what God's dwelling place is going to look like. We've already talked about the Ark of the Covenant. This is like it's called the footstool. It's where he rests his feet, if you will, where he dwells in his living room, basically. And the Ark of the Covenant is going to be placed in like this small tent room, which is inside a larger tent, which is inside like a courtyard. And we're going to get into those details. But the ark is where his presence is, where he resides. And then we've already also talked about the table of the bread and the menorah, the candlestick. And then we get into, starting here in chapter 26, the tabernacle. This is like, it literally means dwelling place, okay? But it's a tent and it's mobile, so it's, like a mobile home. But it's like a tent, like a really massive tent made out of really high quality materials that can be kind of, taken apart so it can be moved, as God is going to lead them through the desert for 40 years. And every time they move, they're going to have to take down the tabernacle and set it back up wherever they go to the next place. So God is about to give Moses instructions for the tabernacle, God's dwelling place. Inside the tabernacle will be this like smaller tent where the ark is kept, but the table of the bread and the candlestick are all inside the tabernacle, along with some really ornate and beautiful decorations that have a garden-esque look about them. Almost like it sounds like a recreation of Eden, kind of. Now, this is going to be a little bit interesting because there are plenty of other pagan religions and other cultures that in their place of worshiping their gods and their deities also included some garden-esque designs and imagery. However, and scholars agree with this, is that there was a huge difference between those garden imagery items and the garden pictures inside the tabernacle. Traditionally, the garden imagery used leading up to the pagan gods' like statue or their idol where they resided, if you will, the imagery was intended to draw the attention of the worshiper to worship that deity for having created. Oh, they belong in this paradise, this perfect place, and they created it, and it's all theirs. And it, this attitude of giving them homage for how powerful they are. But the difference here is that God is not doing it to say, hey, you have to give me credit. He's actually doing it to draw their attention, the worshippers' attention, to remind them, I am present in the garden. Like, yes, that the original design and intention of creation was for God to dwell among his people. So let's do what we can to kind of recreate that space, this sacred, holy ground full of these decorations and like these tapestry work of leaves and plants, this garden feel. And some of these measurements that are going to be going through, 20 cubits and 15 cubits and, read it for yourself, by the way. I know it's going to sound boring and I'm not making it sound any more entertaining, but there's value in reading it. We're just going to try and take a step back and look at this bigger picture of what the original reader would have thought of when they read this. Because in the New Testament, Hebrews tells us that all of these things, the tabernacle, the ark, the bronze altar, the water basin, the court, like all of these are supposed to be like kind of pictures, little glimpses into what it's like in heaven, kind of the structure and the setup for how people worship God literally in his presence. And God is giving Moses like these physical qualifications, right? God is spirit, and he created these spiritual beings who have kind of stolen some of his spiritual beings in rebellion, have stolen this imagery, used it for themselves. But God is trying to give a spiritual picture in a physical context, right? So some people get really, really hung up on, the details here are so crucial. God wanted exactly this way. And yes, to an extent that's true, but ultimately what he's trying to do is convey a spiritual reality in a physical way, right? How does that even work? Like, we can't even wrap our minds around that, but that's what God is doing here. He's taking these spiritual things and giving us a glimpse, a shadow of what it's like to be in his presence. And Exodus chapters 25 through 31, we see these are all of God's instructions about constructing a place where God can dwell, what it's going to be like for God to dwell with his people. These people who really aren't too thrilled, right? They've done plenty of bitching and moaning about God. They're not too thrilled with God. They're not eagerly looking to worship God. They're not necessarily like, oh, we want God's presence. In fact, when they came to the mountain, they said, Moses, you go, we'll wait here. We would rather you go into God's presence because that's not something we're super interested in. And there's some other reasons. Read it for yourself. But this is what it looks like to dwell in God's presence. Not because the people are trying to appease God and get him to be with them, but because he wants to be with them. He wants to fulfill his promise. He wants to be with his people. And there are, in chapters 25 through 31, 7 instances where God offers a vocal command, where it says, and God said to Moses, or to Moses, God said, some iteration of, and then God spoke to Moses about creating this thing that will facilitate a dwelling place for God. Again, this callback to the 7 days of the original creation, when God gave 7 verbal commands. Let there be light. Let there be earth and water, right? Each day God gave a command, let it be this thing. And then there's this also cherry on top that really drives it home for the Israelite readers, is that the 7th command, the 7th time God speaks in both instances, is about, you guessed it, Sabbath. Rest. And that's actually where we're going to end up at the end of this episode today. But that's just this really cool connection that the original Israelite reader, the Hebrew, is going to make that connection. God is recreating his dwelling place, and he's got to do it in a bit of a different way because of sin. And so, because of sin, he one of the instructions he gives to Moses is to create a bronze altar for sacrifice. Now, if you remember, the Ark of the Covenant is covered in gold, and the table is gold, and the candlestick is gold, and those are inside the tabernacle. But the bronze altar, which is going to be used for sacrificing animals, shedding blood and burning up their bodies, is made of bronze. And just like there's kind of these zones of holiness, right? Sacred ground. The closer you get to God, the more holy or righteous, purified, whatever you have to be. So too are kind of the use of precious metals and rare fabrics, colors, dyes, and designs. And outside the tabernacle is this bronze altar made of a pretty, not that it's worthless, but it certainly isn't as valuable as pure gold used to cover the tabernacle. So the value of the materials used get progressively more rare, beautiful, and expensive the closer you get to the presence of God. Outside, altar of bronze. This is where sacrifice is made. Blood is shed, and the animals are offered to God as a sacrifice. And there's this kind of idea that floats around, and just on the surface, when you read through scripture, there is this idea that the sacrifice is in order to kind of cover over sin, to hide the sin, or to push back the consequence of sin. But remember, if we go back to Exodus, we're in Exodus, sorry. If we go back to the Exodus, the Passover, remember it was the blood is the indicator to the Spirit of God at that moment to pass over. This is a protective sacrifice. The blood actually protects. Now, what we need to realize is that God wants to be in the presence of the people. So this sacrifice, there's something about this that can't just be it covers over or it hides the sin, because sin cannot exist in the presence of God. Maybe you've heard God can't exist in the presence of sin, and I kind of hate that, because it's if there's sin, then God has to run away and oh, sin, I can't be around sin. No, but sin actually can't exist in the presence of God. So what God is doing is he's creating a system to get rid of sin, to purge sin out of the camp. It like blasts it, right? Like a sonic boom. It just pushes it out of God's presence so that he can dwell within the camp of the people. He has his tent, the tabernacle, which is among all the other tents of the nation of Israel. And so the way that we get rid of sin, that we blast it out of the camp, is to make a sacrifice. And there's something about, and there's different types of sacrifices. Sometimes there's daily sacrifices, there's special sacrifices on holidays, there's like the annual sacrifice that needs to be made. There's tons of different types of sacrifices that God kind of institutes, and he says, okay, here are ways that we need to get rid of the sin that you're going to commit. He doesn't say, all right, now here are all the ways that you can avoid sinning. When we get the law, which I don't know if we're ever going to get to, but it's this picture of these are the ways that these are the things that you will do, you need to make sacrifices for, right? Like these are the things that actually make it impossible for me to be present with you. And yes, there are some of the instructions are avoidable. Some people could say, oh, we can avoid doing that, right? But then some of them are like, God even has a law about unintentional sin. Like when you accidentally sin, here's the sacrifice, right? That we need to get rid of the presence of sin. On the bronze altar, there are horns. Now, horns are interesting because they're also used in other pagan cultures and religious practices, kind of these indications of pagan worship and the gods. But traditionally, in the East, a horn, Middle East, Near East, the horn represents power. And so there is like this indication of, well, we're acknowledging the power at work here. Now, God's giving them instructions, so it's not like they're adding this. God is using something they're familiar with to draw attention to the power at what's being done here. Like they could have put horns on the altar, they could have put horns on the table, they could have put horns on something else, but they put the horns on the altar. God says put the horns on the altar to, and he didn't say this, but almost as this reminder to say, this is the power of God at work to make it so that you can be in his presence. Because without this power of purging the sin, getting it out of the camp, there is no way you dwell with the Father, right? So it's the ancient imagery of power. And we actually see horn mentioned several times throughout Scripture. We see it in the Psalms where he says, let's see here, the horn of the wicked will be cut off, but the horn of the righteous will be preserved. We see horns being used as like this picture of power in Zechariah and Ezekiel, elsewhere in Psalms. I will raise up a horn in Israel. Also, the lamb in Revelation has 7 horns. So it's just this picture of power that God is taking something they're already aware of, familiar with, and reorienting the way that they think about it to draw their attention to the one true God who is real power. And the bronze basin is kind of set away from the entrance of the tabernacle in the middle of something called the court of the tabernacle. And this is like a wall made out of sticks and sheets. That it's like this big open area that encompasses the tabernacle. So the Holy of Holies is a tent inside the tabernacle. The tabernacle is inside this wall of sheets called the court of the tabernacle. This is a really big, wide open space where the bronze altar is. People will come to give their sacrifices, to watch and participate in worshiping God through sacrifices. And it's again, these zones of holiness. Outside the court of the tabernacle is where everyone just lives their lives regularly. You come into the court of tabernacle to make a sacrifice, to atone for sin, to cast it out, part of worshiping and purifying yourself, right? Then but that's as far as, the civilians can go. Then the priests can go into the tabernacle, but only the high priest goes into the Holy of Holies. And I say that the court of the tabernacle is made out of sticks and sheets, but it's a very specific, special type of linen, okay? And it's the same linen that the clothes of the priests wear. There's the same type of material used, and that's, again, part of this zones of holiness, sacred ground to participate in. Now, the priests have special clothing that they have to wear, but kind of, like a military uniform. You only wear it when you're on duty. When you're a civilian, you wear civvies, right? But when you're on the job, you wear your uniform. And they have a very specific uniform ascribed to them. But the high priest has even has different clothing that he's supposed to wear. Again, progressively, it's represented in the space, in the people, in the clothes, in the material. Everything about this like progressive sacred space is intended to draw the attention of the worshiper. Man, we're on sacred ground. We're in a holy place. And the closer we get, the more important it is. We need to just be aware of that. And the high priest has a little bit of different clothing. He has an ephod. He has a breastplate called the breastplate of judgment. He has a special headpiece, special underwear. He wears a crown. The high priest originally, from what we can tell, was God's intention to represent the leadership of Israel. He was meant to be king and priest. We see that in Melchizedek, when back in Genesis, go check that out, when Abraham pays homage to the king of Salem, who was the king and high priest. Like, that was God's original design and his intention for the high priest to be the leader, the authority in Israel. We see later in the New Testament that Jesus is the king and high priest. That's how God wanted it to work. But Moses, who was supposed to be this high priestly figure, the king, the leader, the authority, he kept dragging his heels, kicking his feet, and God finally made a concession and said, okay, I'll let you be like the king figure, the leader, and I'll make your brother Aaron the high priest. And that's when that role split. But the high priest is supposed to be like this leader figure, this authoritative figure in Israel. And we see that with the crown that's placed on his head. And again, he is set apart. There's only one high priest at a time. In the New Testament, the high priest position becomes more like a political position, but here God is establishing, like, no, it's I pick who the high priest is, and he's the only one who can come into my presence after Moses. Moses is going to kind of come in and out, but once they make it into the promised land, into Canaan, it's the high priest only who comes in. And there's this consecration process for the priests and the high priest, and it's washing, bathing, putting blood on your toes and your fingers and your forehead, on your earlobe, like all of these different things. Again, this progressive process of making pure those who are in service to God. So everyone, the whole nation needs to be made pure because they're a kingdom of priests, right? So that's the need for the sacrifice to cast out all the sin from the whole camp, not just the priests. But then the priests themselves have like this extra step of purification. And then the high priest himself has even more steps. Again, that progressive, holy, sacred space. And then there's instructions about the sacrifices. Okay, the sacrifice is to purge the camp of sin. And it's like, okay, that's great. We're going to drain the blood and, put the blood over here. We're going to burn the flesh and all this. And we're going to, do all these different things. And then there's this weird instruction about burning the liver. Like, why? Why do we need this, it just seems arbitrary. Like, there are other organs. Why the liver? And what archaeologists have found is actually there have been carvings of livers with enchantments, incantations, and spells written on them. In the ancient world, the East, Middle East, Near East, the liver was used as like a medium to speak with the dead, or to divine with gods, right? And get visions and to communicate with supernatural beings. And so God says, look, I just want to make sure we're especially clear on the liver. Just burn it. Like, I don't even want you guys like messing with that or even thinking about entertaining the type of behaviors that these other pagan cultures are involved in. Just burn it. Then we get to the altar of incense. This is made like the ark, made of acacia wood, covered in gold, and the instructions are that the high priest, Aaron at this time, but the high priest in general, will always burn incense before God. Some critics try to say, well, this is just because the sacrifice, shedding blood is going to reek. And then when you burn the flesh and the hair, like that's just going to create this really horrible aroma. So you would just burn incense to try and make it smell better. But some real biblical scholars actually take a different perspective. And it's like, no, this is actually to identify you're standing on sacred ground. This is a holy place. And there's very specific instructions and ingredients on how to make the incense and the oil that's used for burning and creating this aroma. And the instructions actually say, do not use this for personal use. This is only to be used in the tabernacle, in the sanctuary of God. Do not make this common. Do not treat this as like a casual, flippant thing. This is supposed to remind you God is with you. You ever have that like sense memory? Like, I don't remember how old I was when my grandma died, but I know I was really young. But every once in a while, I'll like smell her perfume. And I know she's not there, but just for a second, like I snap out of whatever I was thinking or whatever I was doing, and I'm like, oh, that reminds me of my grandmother. And this incense, that its ingredients are unlike the incenses burned by other pagan worshipers, for their own ritualistic agendas. This incense is used to remind people God is here. He is with you. You're in sacred ground. So when, you're having a fight with your spouse, or you're pissed off at your neighbor for his tree hanging into your yard, or you're just mad at your boss, the shit has hit the fan and you've lost your mind, but then a gentle breeze just kind of blows through the camp the right way and everyone catches a whiff of the incense, and it's like, oh yeah, God's with us. You're frantic about how you're going to pay the bills, and you just get this reminder, oh yeah, God is with us. You don't know what decisions to make for the future, but there's this reminder, oh yeah, God is with us. And this smell is unlike anyone's house. It's unlike the smells of the pagans. This is unique to our God, and He is with us. And I think that's a really cool picture of what is going on here. Then we get the bronze basin of washing. Okay, so the bronze altar is outside. It's kind of far away from the entrance of the tabernacle, but it's within the court of the tabernacle. Then a little bit closer to the tabernacle, the entrance, is a bronze basin for washing. So as the priest moves from the altar closer to the entrance of the tabernacle, they're going to come upon this big bronze bowl with water in it, where they're supposed to wash their hands and their feet before they enter the tabernacle. So this progressing through the zones of holiness, sacrifice, washing, entering into service of God, right? These processes. And there's this, I love this picture that he establishes, hey, by the way, washing water is going to have a permanent place in the purification process. And, I just think that's really interesting as a tie-in to the New Testament, where Jesus says, hey, part of the purification process, part of becoming a disciple is water, baptism, right? So that's just an interesting little connection there. God says this is always going to be part of that purification process. And he does say, if you don't wash your hands and feet before you enter the tabernacle, you're dead. You're dead, son. Okay. So then we get a census tax. And this is very different from chapter 25, where God offered, hey, free will offer to contribute to the materials needed to make all of this stuff, the tabernacle and the altar and the ark and all this stuff. That was people give freely of your own accord. This is a required tax. Everyone is going to pay the same amount. And it's not for the materials, it's for paying the people who are going to put it together. God has a few people in mind who he thinks, man, they're going to be perfect to put this stuff together. They've got great skills and great character. I'm going to use those guys. It's what the census tax does is it pays their salary. Otherwise, they'd just be doing it for free, right? No, he's going to take care of his workers and he's going to pay them. And the census tax is a gift given, it's required, so it's not a gift, but it's this idea of you're going to pay an acknowledgement for the salvation that God offered you. Look, the tabernacle, this is a place where God's going to dwell. Because God wants to, despite your grumbling, despite your bitching and your moaning, I want to be with you. And everyone needs to participate in that. This isn't like you can just do whatever the hell you want and God's going to overly bless you abundantly anyway. So everyone has to contribute to this tax. It's the same amount. Everyone has to pay the same amount. So it's not like a rich person could say, I'm going to give more so I've got a little bit more of God's favor. And the poor person is considered equally as valuable as everyone is on equal standing when it comes to participating in the construction of God's dwelling place. I participated in that. Everyone participated in this thing where God is going to dwell among his people. It's this expectation. We're all involved in this. No one is excluded, and everyone is part of what he wants to do. Like I said, God has a few people in mind for constructing these things and what he wants made and how he wants it done. He knows that they have the skills. And then it says that the Spirit of God was upon them and helped them construct these things. This is very different. So we get some writings from ancient Babylon, some Canaan writings, these pagan stories about how the gods, even the book of Enoch, talk about how these spiritual beings in rebellion, the gods, gave people supernatural divine knowledge. And some of them refer to, if you remember, the Tower of Babel, like that was divinely given. Like these gods, these spiritual beings rebelling against Yahweh, gave people supernatural divine knowledge on how to build these like ornate, massive constructions where they would not have been able to figure it out on their own. But this is very different. God is not giving like secret construction plans. He gave the broad, very generic, it's a tent, it's boxes, it's a candlestick. Like there's nothing unordinary, extraordinary. There's nothing supernatural about what's being made. But God's Spirit is upon these people in order to help them create what he wanted them to make. And so that's just a really interesting thing that we kind of see here. And then chapter 31 ends, in verse 13, God says to Moses, but above all, keep my Sabbaths holy. Out of everything that I've instructed you to do, out of all the things I want you to pay attention to, never neglect the Sabbath. And this ties back to, again, the seventh day of creation where God rested, made it a holy Sabbath. And out of all of these things that he wants his people to recreate in order for his presence to be there, he wants their attention to land on Sabbath. Because Sabbath seems to be one of the most difficult laws for Israel to follow. Repeatedly, they break it. They don't keep it holy. They're told, God says, you've profaned my Sabbath. Sabbath is stopping what you're doing. It's not how much work you do. It's not about what you can accomplish. It's about what God has accomplished. Are you taking the time to reflect on and remember how well God has provided for and taken care of you? All the things that he has created, all the things that he's done for you. Profaning the Sabbath is, repeatedly done. This is one of the major reasons why God brings in discipline to Israel, because they take their eyes off of all the things that God has done for them. They neglect to pay attention to and care about all the ways that God has provided and protected. This habit, he's protecting them from a few things. The first is, look, if you don't stop working, you will die. Like, that's just a reality. Like, you'll work yourself to death. And scripture even talks about how there have been Sabbaths where people are just like itching to get back to work. They're like, okay, is the Sabbath over yet? Because I really want to get back to work. But God's like, no, that you're missing the point. Just rest. Take some time to appreciate all that I've done for you. And so not only is it like this protection for people, it's in a physical generic sense, but it's also like this spiritual protection, because it's God saying, look at all the ways I've done this for you. And the more you take your eyes off of, you fail to give attention to the ways that God has been generous and providing and protecting. Your attention lands on yourself looking to provide, protect, and to create, right? And that just leads to an attitude of, I would much rather be back in Egypt. I'd rather be a slave, abused because I'm working my ass off, than to be a child of God. That's the direction that God is protecting his people from. I don't want you to go back there. I don't want you to be focused on what you can accomplish. I want you to appreciate, just enjoy all the ways that I've taken care of you. And this is what he wants for the people that he is going to be dwelling with. If you guys have enjoyed this content, please check out my sources below. I'm sure they would appreciate it. And I can't wait to be getting into the rest of Exodus. We'll be, going through the rest here. I'm not sure how we'll lump it up because there's a lot of weird instructions and laws and things. But yeah, stick around as we finish up Exodus. Please, again, check out The Long Table. It's a series that we've been working on also here on Dumb Christian. Check that out. Hit subscribe, like, share this with your friends and family so we don't go on this journey alone. And with that, I will catch you in the next one. I love you guys.